back on the 15th of April last month. And of course, it gives all of us, the CSIS, and I think that still includes Bumari, great joy, to be in this Tanah Abang 3 building again, with new setting, new look, and new facilities. Even though we still have a debate among ourselves whether the old building is more convenient or the new one is better. So I think that debate will never be resolved, depending on who you ask in the CSIS family. I would like to thank Ibu Mari for being here this morning to officially launch what we call the Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum, and especially the Hadi Soesastro public lecture later on, part of the whole program of the Hadi Soesastro Policy Forum. And this policy forum is actually a new initiative by the Australian National University and CSIS with the support of the Indonesia project and also DFAT of Australia. In fact, we have been cooperating with the Indonesia project of DNU for a long time, especially on a specific event to launch the book as a result of the Indonesia's update that is organized in Canberra every September or October. And this year, for the book that we will launch later, especially after lunch, is about education in Indonesia. And for the main event this morning, the Hadi Soesastro lecture, let me give you a very brief overview about the idea itself, because we believe that Hadi Soesastro's relationship with the NU was very strong. And then I think Hadi played a very instrumental role in forging a very close collaborations and also cooperations and friendship between CSIS and DNU, especially the Indonesia project. And Hadi had a lot of interest, and that he did a lot of research. It covers all kind of issues, not only on the economic issues. I remember when I was still a student in Bandung, I read this paper on the strategic environment, on defense spending, on arms race, and so on. So please don't claim Hadi only for the economists, because he's also a strategic thinker. So that's why probably in the future, because we believe that, and we hope, of course, this Soesastro lecture is not going to be one off event. That we hope that we can continue to cooperate with the NU and DFAT to organize this Soesastro lecture every year. So probably sometime in the future we might also look at issues such as the arms race or defense spending or the economy of defense development and so on, which also I think form a very important part of Hadi Soesastro's work, especially during 70s and also 1980s. So we thought that a lot of issues that Hadi paid attention to were not really discussed yet by the academic and policy communities in Indonesia and also in the region. So we hope this Soesastro lecture could actually highlight those issues that are really close to Hadi's heart during his tenure. He was one of the founders of CSIS since late 1960s, and especially since 1971. So because of that, we thought that the forum is an appropriate place for anybody who is interested on those issues that Hadi really had a lot of interest to discuss further his ideas and also the issues and the topic that he paid attention to while he was with us. And of course, for the first lecture, we are very happy and also honored to have Pak Hamid, who I think worked way back with Hadi, very early on. And then I think nobody else who knows what Hadi's work as better as Pak Hamid. So for that we really grateful Pak. Dan mungkin tidak hanya sekali ini Pak Ham, we might invite you also again in the future to give another Soesastro lecture, because like Pak Hadi you also cover all issues beyond economics, and then I thank you for that, especially with the East Asia Forum, because we wrote on Foreign policy and so on. So I will discuss. I will tell you a little bit later about Hadi's bio and also his achievement and why we decided, to ask Hadi to deliver the first Hadi Soesastro lecture. And finally, I would like to thank the Indonesia project, the EMU, and also, of course, the DFAC, for the continuous support and also cooperations with, with CSIS. And before I introduce Pak Agil and present Pak Agil a letter, I would like to ask Ibu Mari Pangestu, who has kindly agreed to officially launch, because she's a minister, so the word officially is very important, to officially launch the Hadi Soesastro lecture series. Please do.
My name is Budy Resosudarmo. Currently, I am the head of Indonesia project at ENU. On behalf of the Indonesia project, I would like to thank all of you to come to this event. I would like to thank CSIS for a long-term collaboration. We really appreciate it and looking forward for future activities together. I would like to thank Sukma for her willingness to come over here to launch this event. And finally, I also would like to thank, on behalf of the project, to thank OUSAID for its support to the project, so the project could contribute and participate in this activity. Hadi is special for a new Indonesia project. He opened up a link between us and conduct a link between us to Indonesia, providing us a way path to conduct research and guiding us in a way on what topics that could be important that we would like to research on. It is certainly an honor for us to be able to participate in this activity. And personally, Hadi is a friend for many of the ANU researchers, particularly those who work for the Indonesia project. And for the younger researchers in the Indonesia project, Hadi is a mentor for us. He is very insightful, a good researcher, and also his contribution to policies developed in Indonesia amazed many of us. Though unfortunately he might not be easy to be replaced by future generations to get, but something that we probably need to work on. Thank you very much for coming over here. Let's move on to the next activity.
Rizal, Budy, all friends from CSIS and all honored guests. Selamat pagi, good morning. Today is really a special day. Today we are here to honor our former boss, mentor, teacher, and friend, Hadi Soesastro. Today is a special day. After 3 years of his passing away, we are honoring his memory and great contribution in the way that I believe he would have liked the most, which is to have a public lecture, have a discussion and debate following after that. I and all of us at CSIS and all of Hadi's friends and colleagues would like to appreciate the Australian government and the Indonesia Project ANU for this really, really great idea to have the Hadi Soesastro lecture. And I think a few months ago there was also the occasion of the 2 Hadi Soesastro scholarships which will be given every year, which was announced during Bob Carr's visit to Indonesia. I think again, I couldn't think of a greater way to honor the memory of our dear colleague and friend Hadi Soesastro than through the way that he believed in the most, which is public discourse and investing in the young and in education. Today is also special in many ways. It is really the first public event that we are having in our old location. It's kind of a sad irony. I believe the last event we had in the old building was actually Pak Hadi's wake. before we actually tore down the old building. So on a more happy occasion today, we are, I think it's very befitting that we are having our first public event in our new building, old location, new building. It's like something old, something new. Old location, new building, a new room. But if you are familiar to CSIS, if you look at the stained glass on the top, that's a part of the old auditorium. So are the tables, by the way, and the chairs. So it's something old, something new, and I believe that if Hadi was still alive today, he would be smiling and be very excited that we've now finally come back to our old location in a new building. And he would be very excited, and I mean, I can just see him going around looking at the lights, fixing the paintings, looking at the carpet, because that's the kind of person he was. He was a very detailed person, and he would be out there or making sure the organization of the meeting would have been in order. And I'm sure he would have been the one staying up all night. I believe some of you stayed up all night making sure that this room was ready for today's occasion. Today was also special, as if it was timed that we opened the front page of Compass today. And we saw on the front page was a really good discussion of the recent CSIS polling on elections and presidential candidates, with the main message, rakyat ingin figur alternatif, or the people want an alternative figure or a new figure. I think even Hamid is wearing red today. It's as if this front page article was really timed for today's occasion. The CSIS polling has been widely discussed all week in the newspapers and media, and I think it's achieved its aim in putting forth an objective and empirically valid result of a study for wider and informed public discussion. Last year, at the crucial time, our economic team also contributed to the fuel subsidy debate. Our team of various members have also been contributing to the preparations of Indonesia as the host of APEC this year. These are all what Hadi would have been really proud of. And it is all about what we do in CSIS, which is really how to have objective discussion based on informed data, informed discussion, informed study, and allow the discussion to be based on these various aspects. Hadi would have been proud of all these achievements, and this is our strength. So I would like to take this occasion to congratulate the CSIS team, especially those from the younger generation. Hadi would have been proud of it. I would also like to appreciate and thank Hal Hill, one of our old friends, but also esteemed scholar and professor at the ANU, for giving the talk today. The topic chosen is befitting of one large body of work of which Hadi Soesastro has been actively part of since the 70s, which is really about regional architecture and how it translates into ASEAN, East Asia, and APEC and Asia Pacific, or even more globally. We often still refer to his earlier writings and find that the ideas embodied in them are still as relevant today as they were when he first envisaged them. And they always serve, I think, as reminders of where we have come from and where we want to go. And I really actually do have a storage in my computer of all his previous writings, especially some of the seminal ones on whether it's on ASEAN, APEC, or on East Asia or G20. And I often refer to them to remind me of the major ideas and original concepts that he had. He was there, I think, at the birth of many of these organizations. ASEAN, APEC, you name it, he was there. And he was there in person and in thinking and in vision. And I think many of his ideas we take for granted today. We never thought about who was the original conceptor of this idea. I think if you trace back the writings, I think I did this some time ago, you will find that even the 3 pillars of APAC, you will find that he was actually the first one to have come up with this whole notion of capacity building, of which we really take for granted today, and of which we always say liberalization and facilitation must always be accompanied by capacity building. And we have actually even taken it further in 2011 when we were devising the East Asian architecture, that capacity building actually should precede liberalization. That's kind of the lessons learned in the way we see globalization. Finally, I would like to honor Pak Hadi's memory by recalling what he is to myself personally and to many of us. I think my reflections would be the same for many of you. I think Budy mentioned about how he was insightful, how he was kind to the younger people, and so on. And this is really what all of us have felt in our interactions with Pak Hadi. I myself, I graduated from calling him Om Minky or Uncle Minky to not knowing how to call him. When I first came back with my degree and started my first day at CSIS, I was not quite sure how I should call him. I certainly should not be calling him Om Minky since he was now my boss. And for a long time I didn't call him anything, because should I call him Pak Minky, Pak Hadi, like everybody else, or what should I call him? In the end, I graduated to just calling him Minky. In my later years, when I felt confident that I could consider myself as his colleague. This is to show how he is as I think a nurturing figure to younger people. He was really a mentor and advisor, and as a colleague. So he shifts from being your mentor and advisor to your colleague, because you can really have. Even though you are from a younger generation, you can really have a good debate with him, and he would not get upset, and he would really give you a guidance in a critical way, but in a constructive way. I think there's not a day that goes by when I'm thinking about something important, whether it's a policy issue or a moral dilemma. I mean, government people do face a lot of moral dilemma. Yeah, okay. Are we doing the right thing? Are we doing the right policy? Are we pleasing everybody? Should we be pleasing everybody? There's not a day when I'm thinking about some policy matter or a moral dilemma that I'm thinking about that I don't reflect. What would Pak Minky have thought about this? That's sometimes in my gut reaction. That's kind of how I try to make sure that I'm in the right direction when I'm thinking about policy. He was really sorely missed during the year when we were chair of ASEAN in 2011. And this is honestly what I did. I went back and read many of his writings to remind us really what was the thinking in the way we look at regionalism. And he was also the most thoughtful boss and friend to have. And it is really the small things that he does that touches all of us. You can all have your own personal recollection of what Pak Minky has done for you. But for me, he was there for all the important occasions in my life. Sorry, I'm tearing up. He was there from the beginning, in my formative years as a researcher and economist, to my graduation as a full-fledged research fellow, head of economics department, and finally as the executive director of this institution. He was there at my wedding and actually organized my wedding, including picking the decoration and the food and everything. It was like he was part of the family, the big CSIS family, and of course the whole CSIS was there also as the Agar Ayu and everything. He was there at the birth of my first child. He was the godfather of my son, and he also picked the name. Raymond is the name of my son. It's actually because he was born on the 7th of January, and it's Saint Raymond's Day. That's how Pak Hadi picked the name. And then in my transition into government, he was always there to answer questions, give ideas and pointers, hold discussions at the spur of the moment, give policy and moral guidance, and most important, moral support. I think he is what kept us together as CSIS and wider family of friends. And he was the intellectual guiding light for many of us. And I think in this new building where we are today, I hope that his vision, we as CSIS family, we can continue his vision, continue the work of CSIS in this new spirit of togetherness in our new building. Between the seniors in this room and the younger people and all the new friends of CSIS, we hope that CSIS can continue its good work in the spirit of Hadi Soesastro, how to have informed public debate, especially as Indonesia is facing challenging times in moving towards new democracy, consolidating the democracy, and as we face new changes. Selamat datang, Yang Wiyanti. So Pak Hadi is our boss, our mentor, our teacher, and our friend, but also a husband, and I don't think Agus is here, but also is Agus here? Yeah. Agus and a father. So I just finished my remarks, but really Pak Hadi is special, I think, to many of us in this room for various different reasons. But I'm very happy today. Today is a really special occasion that we have the first Hadi Soesastro lecture in our new home, in our old location, but in our new home. And I really like to close by emphasizing that the best way to honor Pak Hadi's memory is to continue his good work with a new spirit of togetherness and a new spirit to make sure that we continue the vision of Pak Hadi in making sure that we're always thinking about good policy, building institutions, both for our national good as well as our contribution to the region and to the world. I thank you, and I thank Hal again for his lecture today, the first Hadi Soesastro lecture, and I couldn't think of a more fitting topic on East Asia. One of, I think, Pak Hadi's, in his recent years, before he passed away, one of the things that he really worked hard on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Mari, Ibu Yanti, and Agus. Selamat datang. Ibu Mari mentioned about the people looking for alternative candidate, and I agree that alternative candidate means progress. It took me, when Pak Fokke was the governor, it took me 1 hour 15 minutes to come to the office. Now it took me 2 hours. So it's progress. Anyway, now is the first Hadi Soesastro lecture. It's going to be presented by Pak Arndt. But before that, let me summarize, his achievement, because it's quite long. But a lot of important things to mention. But of course, the most important one is that Pak Arndt is actually a guru for many of us here at CSIS. Especially many of our staff here also actually studied with Pak Arndt and worked with Pak Arndt in his capacity as a professor in the Australian National University. He was the head of the departments from 2004 to 2007, and from 1986 to 1998, he headed the Universities of Indonesia project, and for much of this time also edited the bulletin of the Indonesian Economic Studies. I think that's the only bulletin on university economy that's widely read. His areas of research is very vast, like I mentioned earlier. But Pak Arndt paid a lot of attention to the economies of ASEAN, and also including country case studies and thematic issues, comparative work, industrialization and foreign investment in Asia, and also the political economy of the development. And he has authored and also edited a lot of books, at least 16 books, and has written about 140 academic papers. That's hard to read, I think. And also one of his, I think, masterpiece is the book entitled The Indonesian Economy since 1966, and now it's in the second editions, published by the Cambridge University Press, and also books on the Philippines economy and also on the Malaysia's development challenges. Pak Hal actually has worked also as consultant, for the Australian government, the Indonesian government, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and several United Nations agencies. And he also has held a number of appointments at Gajah Mada University, the Columbia University, Oxford University, and also the IUG, or International University of Japan in Niigata, and also the Tinbergen Institutes. And I think he's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia. And in 2011, this is very important, Pak Halil, he was an official guest of Indonesia as a presidential friend of Indonesia. So Pak Halil will talk about the financial safety net. Initially, we don't plan to have the Q&A sessions, but just now I had a very brief chat with Pak Budy, and we thought that probably, if with your permission, Pak Halil, to allow one or two questions, before we close the first Hadi Soesastro lecture. Now I would like to invite, Professor Halil, to deliver, his lecture.
Selamat pagi dan banyak terima kasih atas kesempatan ke sini dan banyak terima kasih atas undangan ini, khusus kepada Bapak Rizal. Senang sekali Bapak, saya selalu senang datang ke CSIS. Juga terima kasih juga kepada Ibu Mari Pangestu. Saya kenal baik selama hampir 40 tahun. Dan juga kepada Ibu Yaki, selamat pagi Ibu Yaki. Ini saya juga senang sekali oleh karena ini pertama kali saya ke gedung ini, gedung baru. Ya. Sudah lama saya di gedung lama di tempat lokasi yang sama, tetapi gedung baru memang luar biasa. Ya. Very impressive and beautiful building, so it's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much, Pak Rizal, for your kind words. I really appreciate it. Saya beberapa hari sebelum Jakarta saya di Makassar, dan mungkin suara saya masih di Makassar juga. So I will see if I can talk okay. Sebetulnya saya di Jakarta juga bulan yang lalu dalam rangka kegiatan untuk menghormati Pak Hadi Soesastro. Pada saat itu Menlu Menteri Luar Negeri Bob Khan launched the Hadi Soesastro scholarships, an official scholarship announced by the Australian government. Setiap tahun ada 2 beasiswa untuk mahasiswa Indonesia yang mau belajar di Australia dengan atas nama Hadi Soesastro Fellowship. And so we look forward to many emerging scholars coming into Australia. You can study in any university in Australia, any field related to Hadi's research interests. And of course, as Pak Rizal said, ini luas sekali. Hadi's research interests is very wide. I want to say a little bit about Hadi, the person, before I talk about the lecture. And some of my thinking was written in a paper which I wrote, in fact, with Mari Pangestu. It was an obituary in honour of Hadi Soesastro in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies. And I wanted to say a little bit about Hadi the man. I had the privilege of knowing him for 30 years. I first met him in this alamat, not in this building of course, but the tempat ini. I first met Hadi at a conference at CSIS. I've always thought the key to understanding Pak Hadi was he was a man of many parts, as described by Ibu Mari and Pak Rizal juga. He was an institution builder, of course. He was a mentor and a close friend for an extraordinarily wide range of people. He was a bridge builder between Indonesia and the rest of the world, including ASEAN, including Australia, but to the rest of the world also. He was also a bridge builder between government and NGOs, think tanks, between academics as well. He was a passionate advocate for good causes, for good policy, as Mary mentioned as well. He did it in a very quiet way, but he did it very effectively. He was also, as a scholar, he was, I think, a very original thinker, a deep thinker who thought long-term, not just immediate issues, but thought actually long-term, a highly original thinker. Also, he was a very influential policy advisor, and a policy advisor who stayed true to his principles. That's not always easy to do that. You're trying to be pragmatic, but you've got to think, what's first best? And Hadi was the sort of person who was able to keep to his principles all the time. And he was also an unusual person in being able to combine both the philosophical levels of discussion and thinking and also the pragmatic ones. It's always been my impression that he played a central role in making CSIS the preeminent think tank and institution that it is. I think he was executive director for about 15 years, Rizal, an extraordinarily long time. CSIS, of course, is regarded as one of the really top think tanks, not just in Indonesia, but in Southeast Asia. And of course, it's easy enough to create a think tank in a rich country where there are a lot of think tanks available, but in Indonesia where they're quite still masih belum ada banyak ya Pak. And so creating a think tank in a country where there aren't many think tanks, I think it is a really remarkable achievement. I think on issues to do with regional integration, especially ASEAN, both economics and politics. Memang saya setuju dengan Pak Rizal. Hadi was a man with really broad interests, not just economics, but broadly political economy, politics, international relations. My impression was that Hadi was involved in practically every major intellectual and policy initiative involving ASEAN for at least 25 to 30 years. I can't think of anybody else who played a more important role in that respect. And the point that Hadi always emphasized was that ASEAN prospers and Indonesia prospers when it's a case of economic cooperation and integration, which is outward orientation to the world. And that was the point I think Hadi always mentioned. Now, I want to also say a little bit about his scholarship, and here also, as Rizal and Budy mentioned, his range of scholarship was quite remarkable. I had the privilege of reading an autobiographical note which was prepared, written by Hadi, I guess about a year before he passed away, and that was also extremely insightful. He was a very private person. He didn't talk about himself very much, but I guess he was persuaded maybe by Ibu Yanti to talk about himself a bit, and it was a really insightful story of his life. And just at the intellectual level, he had discussions of his personal life. At the intellectual level, he said there were 4 publications which he regarded as his most influential. And I think these 4 publications sort of revealed the extraordinary intellectual diversity of the man. The first piece was actually published in the journal, the CSIS journal, Indonesia Quarterly, and that was on basic energy needs for Indonesia. And I guess that came out of his grand doctoral dissertation. So that was the first one you mentioned. The second one was a piece which I've used many times in my own thinking and writing, also in my own teaching. It was a piece which appeared in the journal Asian Survey on the political economy of reform in Indonesia in the 1980s. I think this is probably his most cited work, actually. It was a really insightful piece, very widely read. And he brilliantly showed how Indonesia avoided the debt crisis in the early to mid-1980s, which most other developing country commodity exporters experienced. He showed how the technocrats were able to persuade President Suharto of the case for reform and how to do it. So it was a political economy piece and a classic. I think it's probably, in many ways, I think his most important paper, of course, among many other important papers. And that was the second paper. The third paper is one I had very close involvement with personally, also published in 1989, and that was on the economic development of East Timor. It came out actually as by accident, at least I think, I came to see Hadi, and I think also Larry actually, about a project I was running on regional economic development in Indonesia. I started it in 1987. I didn't realise it was going to take 3 years of my life and dominate my life for 3 years. It became a very good project. But we were trying to survey the economies of every province, the then 27 provinces of Indonesia. And there were a couple of provinces I thought it just would not be possible to do. So I came to see Hadi and asked for his advice. And I said, well, I'd like to have a survey of East Timor's economy, but it looks too difficult. And Hadi said, actually, I've just been to East Timor, and I'll do it. So he wrote, I think, what was the most important survey of East Timor's economy during the Indonesian period. It was a deep and insightful paper, a broad paper, not just the economics, but again the political economy. And Hadi cited that. I was very pleased to see that actually. Hadi cited that as one of his key papers. Final paper which he cited, which again I knew about very well, was a paper which appeared in the Asian Economic Policy Review, a Tokyo-based journal, the best journal of its kind, I think, covering the whole region on the interface between academic research and government work. Hadi and I were both members of this editorial board, which met in Tokyo twice a year. And Hadi wrote a really insightful piece again on regional integration in East Asia, the achievements, the future prospects, what are some of the issues which have to be looked at. I think it's again, at the time, it's probably the clearest paper looking at East Asia integration issues. Finally, just on Hadi, I want to mention his Australian connections, since they were very important, and mentioned also by Budy and Rizal and Budy. Hadi had a lot of Australian connections. We were very honoured that he accepted an honorary doctorate from our university, the Australian National University, in 2009. He had an extraordinary range of collaborative networks in Australia, as he did, of course, around the world. We had a dinner in Canberra after he got his doctoral award, and he said, very nicely, he's outside Indonesia, he's lived in 3 cities for some period. That's Aachen in Germany, New York in US, and Canberra in Australia. And he thought he actually had the biggest range of contacts, the broadest range of contacts in the 3 cities in Canberra. So we were very honoured when he made that remark. Both his boys, of course, were educated in Australia. We're very proud of that also. And as I mentioned, he connected us at the ANU to a lot of the staff researchers at CSIS. So we regard him as a very special friend, someone who we could also always turn to for wise counsel, even when he was, simple to RPRs and then Sandra sekali without a work. He always seemed to find time to talk to us. So it's a great privilege to be invited to give this lecture. Terima kasih banyak. It's also, let me switch from Hadi the man to some of the issues which Hadi looked at. When I was invited to give this lecture, I'm greatly honoured to be invited. I tried to think of a topic which kind of fitted with Hadi's interests, and it turned out I had been working with a close friend, many of you will know him, Dr. Jayant Menon from the Asian Development Bank. We've been working on this issue of financial safety nets for East Asia. So I chose this topic thinking it does reflect some of Hadi's interests. So here's the question: does East Asia have a financial safety net? As I say, it's a joint work with Jay Menon. Jay Menon, apologises, he couldn't make it here today, but he's here in spirit. Okay, so do I? Okay, yeah, good. So I'm going to talk about the topic. I'm going to introduce the topic and talk about some of the history of it, and then I'm going to talk about. And then I'll talk about the way forward. So, motivation. Why is this topic important? Apart from the fact that Hadi Soesastro talked about it, that's probably justification enough. The fact that he talked about it. The motivation is really the following: we live in a very uncertain global and regional economic environment. And countries have to worry about the fact that what happens if there's some major external shock which is going to destabilise their economies. even well-managed economies like Indonesia's macroeconomic management, of course, is very good, but even well-managed economies like Indonesia need some kind of insurance policy in the event of a really nasty, unexpected, unpredictable economic shock. And the problem at the moment is that all of the traditional solutions which are used to handle these large negative shocks have problems. First of all, the IMF, which has traditionally been the most important insurance policy for most countries, especially developing countries. I think I don't need to say in Jakarta that the IMF is still masih ada bau, yeah? There's still a problem with the IMF. It's still taken in some way. Bukan saja di Indonesia, tapi negara-negara lain juga. The IMF is still politically unacceptable in a lot of Asia. Oleh karena dampaknya setelah Krismon tahun 1997. So the IMF is still sort of politically no in many countries. So that's the first option, which isn't very attractive. The second option is what's called bilateral swap agreements. So that's an agreement where between country A and country B, where country B, which might have large external resources, guarantees a separate swap facility with country A. These work, of course, but they do require negotiation. There's no guarantee that they're going to be available when they're needed, so you can't necessarily rely on them. The third option traditionally has been large international reserves, a sort of mercantilist approach to international economic policy, where because you don't trust the international economic environment, you build up these very large international reserves. And we see that's been the pattern in most of the crisis-affected economies in this part of the world since the late 1990s. But we know it's also costly. That is, the cost of building up reserves, holding them in, say, US T-bills at zero interest rate, funding them from domestic sources where the interest rate is maybe 5 or 6%, is extremely costly. It's also risky. It may invite retaliatory action if you build up large reserves, especially when you're a large country. Like Indonesia as well, actually, but also, especially China, the danger of retaliatory action from across the other side of the Pacific is a problem. For these reasons, some kind of regional initiative for reserves is actually potentially attractive. They avoid the stigma of the IMF. They bypass the need to negotiate complicated swap arrangements with bilaterally. And in principle, they actually reduce the need to maintain very large foreign exchange reserves. So in principle, these regional initiatives are important. They're also important, as I'm sure Hadi would have said, because they do add another layer of regional economic cooperation. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation is to look at the record of these regional initiatives, principally over the past 15 years. So ASEAN, as we know, has developed such a mechanism. Originally it was called the ASEAN Swap Agreement, ASA. Then it became the Chiang Mai Initiative. Then it became the Enhanced Chiang Mai Initiative. And now formally through the establishment of AMRO, the ASEAN Macroeconomic Research Office, in 2011, it looks like there's formal institutional architecture which is put in place to actually guarantee that there won't be another nasty external shock. The central question is these arrangements are as yet effectively untested. The central question we pose in the paper is will the CMAM work in the next crisis? And the answer to our question, just in case you go to sleep for the next few minutes, the answer to the question is we think probably not. So this is architecture which has really been developed, but we're not sure that it's going to work. Okay, so some of the history, I won't go through the history in detail. This arrangement's been around in principle for quite a long time. The Krismon, tahun 1997 was actually the most important event in the history of thinking about these arrangements. But in fact, ASEAN had an agreement earlier called the ASEAN Swap Agreement, established in 1977 by the central banks of the 5 original ASEAN member countries, primarily to provide short-term liquidity support with balance payments difficulties. This was an era when there wasn't the kind of capital market mobility integration which has occurred in the last 15 years. Therefore, countries didn't have to worry nearly as much about sudden capital flight and sudden capital reversals. The initial scheme was set up in 1977, $100 million. Doesn't sound much in dealing with today's crises, which are billions of dollars. They're almost anywhere, even a small place like Cyprus, for example, several $billion. And now, the ASA was basically dormant for the next 2 decades. I'm not aware of it being used in any case. It was sort of on the books, but not really used. When the Asian financial crisis hit the region, it was obviously not usable, and so it didn't play a part in the crisis resolution which happened from 1997, 98, 99. When the Asian financial crisis hit, you recall there was a lot of discussion about what was the best way to handle the crisis externally. Japan at the time proposed a concept called the Asian Monetary Fund. That didn't get anywhere, partly because there wasn't consultation with the other major economy in the region, China, and partly because of opposition from the US. So basically in 1997, reluctantly all countries, except Malaysia, important exception, all countries resorted to the IMF. But as we know very well, especially in Jakarta more than anywhere else, there was a lot of unhappiness with the IMF medicine. Maybe the medicine was worse than the disease, I guess was the general consensus at the time. And so as a result of that, there was at the ASEAN, the AFM, ASEAN Finance Ministers meeting in May 2000 in Chiang Mai, there was the formal establishment of the thing called the Chiang Mai Initiative. So basically it's built on the original ASEAN swap agreement. It now was developed for the 10 ASEAN countries. The funds were expanded from 200 million to 1 billion in a year. And also the network of bilateral swap agreements were kind of essentially folded into that agreement. It then developed a bit further. The fund doubled in 2005 and again in 2008. There's a summary table which sets out the history of some of these developments. But then, just as the Asian financial crisis had exposed the vulnerability or the weakness of the original ASA, ASEAN swap agreement, so the global financial crisis exposed the weakness of the original Chiang Mai initiative. This is a case of, in a sense, learning by doing. Starting initiatives and then seeing whether they would work. It quickly became apparent in late 2008 when the global financial crisis hit. Of course, the global financial crisis, unlike the Asian financial crisis, originated entirely outside the region. It was coming principally from the US. The US had been lecturing Southeast Asia on the importance of having good governance and well-regulated financial markets. And then the crisis, of course, originated principally in the US, but also in the UK to some extent. So the country quickly realised that this architecture which was established beginning in 2000, that is the Chiang Mai Initiative, wasn't going to work. Countries therefore resorted to, didn't want to go to the IMF but needed some insurance policy, and therefore they resorted to these bilateral swaps with US and Japan were the largest, also with the international financial institutions. Australia got involved in it as well. That then triggered a further round of rethinking about this Chiang Mai Initiative, the realisation that it wasn't going to work when needed in a crisis. So, if your house burns down, you want to make sure your insurance policy works okay, and it was obvious that the Chiang Mai Initiative, as originally constructed, wasn't going to work. Therefore, there was a considerable revamping of the Chiang Mai Initiative in March 2010. It became the Enhanced Chiang Mai Initiative, or it was multilateralised essentially. It became the CMIM. The CMIM would be a much larger unit. It would be a self-managed reserve building arrangement governed by a single contract. The contributions would come 20% from ASEAN and 80% from the larger economies of Northeast Asia, as Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea. And sort of various formula were established, and the pool was expanded to $120 billion. So this looked like, this time at least, a substantial commitment from the region. So I wanted to look a little bit at this CMIM and ask the question: is it now workable, or what should be done to make it workable? So the CMIM, excuse the acronyms. This is a kind of presentation where you get a bit involved in acronyms. So CMIM is still it's a common dollar-based liquidity pool. Importantly, the contributions remain in the individual countries' economies' central banks. It's not like the IMF, which has access directly to the pools. The funds remain in the central banks themselves. And the availability, the access to these funds is governed by a formula, a fairly complicated formula. I won't bore you with details, but basically each country has what's called a borrowing multiplier, where they can access funds defined as a multiple of their original contribution. Just for the record, don't try reading this table, but that's the kind of formula which is used. Now, on the crucial question of conditionality, that is, if a country is going to get funds, what conditions attach to it? Remember, this was the problem with the IMF, that countries in the region thought the IMF imposed unreasonable conditions on the operation for accessing their funding. So the enhanced CMIM then specified the beginnings of some kind of conditionality. It said there would be an economic financial review, there would be compliance with the covenants established under the CMIM, and there'd be surveillance reports. So compliance itself is not that difficult. The issue is really not so much stringency, but it's the time involved, especially when you get a rapidly developing crisis. As we know, modern crises, where there's huge and sudden capital flows, arise very quickly. Sometimes they can arise in 24, 48 hours. Think of the most recent case of Cyprus. Basically, the Cyprus crisis blew up, I guess, in about 48 hours. So they're extremely fast moving. When markets suddenly lose confidence in a government or regime or central bank or financial authority, capital exits very quickly. I'll come back to this point because it's central. So the way the CMIM was established, this process is to submit a request to the coordinating countries, the two of them. That gets passed on through a system, an administrative system, which then has to make a response within 2 weeks. Decisions are based on 2/3 majority, weighted voting system, and so on. Now, the IMF hasn't disappeared from this scene. People might like it to have disappeared, but the IMF hasn't disappeared from this story. And that reflects, in a way, I guess, the region's ambivalence that if money is going to be passed out in an emergency, what's the mechanism for ensuring that it's actually effective? And if you haven't really got an alternative to the IMF in terms of conditionality, then you kind of want to keep the IMF somewhere in the background. You don't want it to run the show, but you want it to be in the background. And so the initial deal was that countries could only receive 20% of their quota without IMF conditionality. That's now being relaxed. I think it's now 30% going to 40%. Okay, so as part of the arrangement, this body called AMRO, based in Singapore, ASEAN Macroeconomic Research Office, in a way, de facto, it's really become, I guess, what Japan proposed originally as the Asian Monetary Fund. It's essentially, as I see it, basically, it's the Asian Monetary Fund under a different guise. So this was established and operational in 2011. It's supposed to be an independent surveillance unit. It has its structures defined, so it's got both so-called peacetime and crisis time functions relating to general economic surveys and crisis assessment. Okay, so that's CMIM. What's happened since CMIM was established? Well, there's been quite a lot of activity. Especially as the Eurozone crisis began to hit. Again, this is learning by doing, and so the realization was, if, for example, countries in ASEAN get something like the Eurozone crisis, not through their own policies, which are pretty good in most cases, but through some kind of contagion coming from outside, what's going to happen? Well, there's been further changes. The CMIM pool's been doubled again in 2012, last year $240 billion. It's been increasingly de-linked from the IMF portion to 30%. I think it's now the proposal that it be 40%. They've introduced a crisis prevention facility, and the finance minister meeting is broadened to include the central bank government. So it's a continuous process of evolution. The CMA now has two instruments for its work. It has this short-term liquidity support and a medium-term crisis facility. That's because in a crisis, you've got to work out whether the crisis is one of illiquidity or whether it's one of insolvency. You need different kind of instruments for insolvency as for liquidity. Now, as we know also, crises which might start off being a crisis of insolvency suddenly can become very quickly a crisis of liquidity. So there are these different kind of facilities which have been established. Various other changes which I won't go into in detail, but the scheme is under modification. So the way forward, what's going to happen? We have this architecture which is on the books. It looks impressive. Is it going to work? And we still don't know. And you never really know until you get a crisis. And then you never really know whether your house insurance policy is really going to work until your house is burnt down. Yeah? So we don't really know. The question now is the CMA usable? And some skeptics have said this is a program designed not to be used. Question mark. They're designed not to be used. If it's going to be used, we suggest that there's going to have to be two ways of thinking about it, and they're complementary. One is to think of the CMIM as working in coordination as a complement to the IMF. The other one is to think about the CMIM as an independent operation. So first of all, in working with the IMF, this is actually a common arrangement. You think currently of the Eurozone crisis, and of course the IMF is not doing it by itself, it's doing it with the European Central Bank, with the IMF and the European Commission. So this is a fairly common arrangement. There's quite a bit of co-financing elsewhere. Sorry, I'll come back to that later. So that's one possibility. There's still a question in this case whether CMA as constructed has the efficiency and the speed to be able to deliver something. As one of your country's most famous economists remarked recently, a good friend of many of us, Dr. Jayant, he said, CMA, quote, don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. So you might sort of say, don't really expect this scheme is going to work necessarily at the moment. So what are some of the remaining issues with the CMA if it's going to work as a complement to the IMF? Again, it's not a fund. It's not a fund like the IMF is a fund. It's a reserve pooling scheme. So the money is actually in the central banks of each of the partner economies. So you haven't just got a fund you can, as it were, write the check, because you've got to get the funds from each country's central bank. The decision-making process is not clear that it's going to be quick enough for a crisis. For all the faults of the IMF can take decisions very quickly. In this case, the decision lies with this high-level body. It's actually a non-resident body. It's not one central body, in Jakarta or Singapore or Washington DC or Tokyo, which makes the decision. So, and it also still hasn't been demonstrated that the CMIM is superior to the quick dispersal bilateral swap agreements. Bilateral swap agreements for all the problems. Once you've got them, you can disperse them very quickly. There's also an issue that countries may be reluctant to apply for or to go to a scheme which has an IMF involvement. This again is the stigma of the IMF. In a sense, it's a signalling effect. And so there may be a case for delinking the IMF part of the program in the very short term. For example, our friend Jayant, also a very good friend of Hadi's, of course, the former finance minister of Thailand, said maybe you've got to think about delinking this program in the short term from the IMF. So there's a lot of discussion and conjecture about that. But there's still a question of policy discipline. If you're going to actually have these funds dispersed, what is the policy discipline going to be? And with the two major creditors, remember the crucial creditors in this scheme are still Japan and China. Okay, well, what about the CMA as an alternative to the IMF? That is, can it actually establish itself, in a sense, as an independent regional entity? We think to do that, operating independently of the IMF, there are at least 3 interrelated reforms that are going to be required to make it effective as an operational scheme. The first one is to increase the size of the fund. We think the fund is still probably too small. If you think of crises like Cyprus, a really small economy, already needing a multi-billion-dollar bailout, imagine the kind of scale of funds which are needed for much larger economies like Indonesia, like Thailand, and so on. So the 240 billion we think is almost certainly inadequate. It might sound a lot of money to us ordinary mortals, but it's not a lot of money during a crisis. We think, for example, the original ASEAN 4 countries have a non-IMF quota of about $7 billion. But as we know, the packages way back in 1997-98 were much larger. Thailand about 17 billion, Indonesia about 40 billion. So the quota entitlements, which are currently present under the CMA, almost certainly are going to be inadequate. So you've either got to increase the size of the fund, or you've got to increase the non-IMF limit. So that's my question. The size of the fund. There's some details of some of the arrangements which have been put in place so far. Actually, for some of the newer ASEAN members, that is the economies of mainland Southeast Asia, their quotas are actually quite a substantial share of their reserves. So, for example, we give the example of Cambodia. Its non-IMF quota is about $360 million. Its reserves in 2012 were about $3.6 billion. So, in fact, it tells you that its reserves are already much larger than what it's going to be entitled to draw out of the CMA. So, it's not really going to have much effect. The other point to worry about is that if the crisis is a regional one, that is, as in 1997-98 is predominantly in the region, then the poorer countries would actually be expected to contribute to the rescue packages. That's the kind of paradox of what's happened, for example, with the Eurozone crisis in the past couple of years. For example, that a poorer country like Slovakia has been compelled to contribute to a rich country like Greece. So there could be that kind of issue as well in this part of the world. One proposal is that for countries to shift from their own reserves to a pool contribution and attach their bilateral swaps to the CMA swap. That may be an option. Another question is, if the CMA is unusable, it may actually increase countries' vulnerability to a crisis to the extent that for a country with only moderate reserves, it actually reduces the uncommitted reserves which they can use to actually fight this crisis. So there's some issue about whether the newer, poorer members of ASEAN, the mainland China economies, could actually work. And the danger is if they come under attack because of a speculative cover crisis, we know that the contagion spreads very quickly. It could spread to the larger economies like Indonesia and Thailand and the Philippines. It's also not clear whether the recent increase in the bilateral swap arrangements from the so-called +3 countries will be extended to the other CMA members. So that's the first question. The CMA still seems to be inadequate in terms of its funding resources. Second option we think is important is to expand the membership of the CMA group from the original ASEAN +3, that is the 13 economy, or 14 if you include Hong Kong. We think there's a case for actually expanding the range of countries to be included, and that has the benefit of not only bringing in more funds, but also diversifying the source of the funds and making it less likely that there'll be a region-wide synchronized attack on regional currencies. Countries which aren't as obviously connected to the sort of economic cycles of the ASEAN countries would actually broaden the base. We argue that the most obvious candidates if you're going to extend the CMA beyond the current membership would be the original +3 countries of the East Asian Summit, that is Australia, New Zealand and India. Although they're very tightly connected to East Asia, they're actually diversified and perhaps have the financial strength to be able to broaden the pool. A third feature which we think is important if CMA is going to work is strengthening the analytical capacity and credibility of AMRO. Remember, this crucial question of conditionality arises. If you're going to disperse funds, there has to be some kind of conditionality attached to the funds. And so, if you're not going to use the IMF, what are you going to use? Well, it has to be the AMRO. And it's probably unreasonable to expect AMRO, which is a body less than 2 years old, to actually play that role. But over time, it's got to quickly start to become a credible, analytical, apolitical organisation. It's not an unfair comment to say that AMRO currently lacks the kind of research capacity, skills, experience, institutional credibility to actually play that role as yet. So one couldn't really expect AMRO at the moment to lead a major regional rescue package. The process we have some suggestions about how to reform the process of AMRO reporting. It needs to be a bit more arm's length, we think. Countries have to be prepared in a sense to lose a bit of national sovereignty if there's going to be this supranational body imposing some kind of conditionality. One would hope it's the kind of conditionality which wasn't imposed by the IMF, because clearly that didn't work, but there has to be some kind of conditionality. Okay, summing up. What's our main argument? Well, clearly the search for an effective financial safety net in Asia continues. It's clear the IMF is still deeply unpopular. The most popular approach, which is self-insurance, that is high international reserves, is costly and risky. Bilateral swaps are sort of second preference. They've got undesirable features, although it looks like they're now becoming probably the main line of defence, actually. If you're not going to go to the IMF, you don't really believe CMA is going to work. Bilateral swaps, which we see quite regularly now with larger economies, is kind of becoming the order of the day. So CMA and its predecessors are an attempt to address the problem. There has been some progress, obviously a lot of progress since the original days of the ASEAN Swap Agreement and the original CMI. But there's still the worry, the nagging worry. Is it going to work in a crisis when you really need it? It's not clear yet that it's going to be working. So in fact, some skeptics, I'm not sure whether the skeptics can, but some skeptics do say this is a cosmetic arrangement designed not to be used. Question mark. So the key is going to be to actually reform and enhance the CMA to make it workable. So that's why we've suggested the way that the procedures need to be modified for this rapid release funding procedure. The pool needs to be increased. The proportion also that's non-IMF needs to be increased. The membership needs to be diversified, and AMRO needs to be greatly strengthened and greatly strengthened credibility. So this is work in progress. I wish Hadi was here. He would have been the first person I would have gone to say, this makes sense, this kind of argument. But that's our take on the situation, which is really an important part of the evolving regional argument. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you, Hadi. And I agree with your last statement that you had plans to be here. I think the discussion will be more lively. And also, for me, when I first heard the terms AMRO, and then also Pak Yusuf, I remember, I think like 2 years ago or 1 year ago, Pak Yusuf asked me what AMRO means. And I thought it's a bank, right? And we both wrong. And then Pak Yusuf said, wah, nggak ada si Hadi sih. So actually we miss him a lot, when we come to all these regional economic initiative, because Pak, like you just mentioned, I think it's hard. Pak Budy mentioned it's hard to find somebody who can actually fill in his shoes. But I'm quite confident that our researchers and economists, will soon actually, I think, be able to play that role as well in the not too distant, future. We still have 25 minutes before we break, for coffee, so we can, I think, Pak Hadi also entertain as well. Sure. To give opportunity for all of us to ask questions. But please remember, it's only one person is authorized to give lecture today. That is part of it. So please, don't come forward and give another lecture. But of course, you can challenge some part of these presentations. But again, please make it as brief as possible so we can have more people to raise questions. That's a direct challenge, Kumari. Pak Hamid just said, I would like to hear Kumari's view on this. So if you want to respond.
Yeah, I think perhaps what is the link of all this to what's being talked about in G20? That's kind of the first question. And while you say that the IMF is still unpopular, I think the way the CMIM can be useful is to complement, not to be a substitute for the global institution. But I think the way I have been following this debate and this discussion is how structures such as CMIM and even in the trade area, how ASEAN Plus One and East Asia Free Trade Area is intended to be complementary and building blocks towards the global system. So, I think even though it may not be useful in that as a standalone and as a complement to the global funds that are available, I think that's something that's you'll see in your conclusions. So that would be one question. I think the second question, I was just reflecting that China is an important member in this funding of the CMIM, and what China says and do will make a big difference. Recently the BRICS met, and they tried to start something similar.
The BRICS Development Bank, you mean, or something?
Yeah, but they also started, and then if you read it carefully, because I read the agreement and statement carefully, it was actually more of a bilateral swap and contingency reserve idea rather than a development bank. Development bank comes with huge capital and huge commitment. But in the first instance, I think they agreed on, I think it was 50 million, no, not that much. It was small in comparison to it reminded me of the first steps of CMIM. So, and even in the discussion of the new development bank, are we giving up on the IMF, the World Bank, and where's the World Bank going on this? And even in the discussion on trade, there is a kind of this, what do you call it? A lot of skepticism and pessimism about multilateral institutions. So, my view on this, having thought a lot and recently gone through a lot of thinking on the trade area, which is, I think, similar to the financial area, is I don't think you can replace the multilateral institution. They're there, and what they've done in the past and what they can continue to do in the future for certain the rules that are there, enforcing the rules are still very important. But I think the answer is how do you strengthen the regional institutions to be complementary or to actually, hopefully, be a good model for how the multilaterals should be going.
Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak, Mary. I think you made a really crucial point, and that, which I should have mentioned, that is one of the impacts of something like CMIM and other initiatives is that the IMF has responded. The IMF is now not the IMF of the late 1990s. A very good example of that is the IMF's view on capital controls. As we know, it was dogmatically opposed to the principle in the 90s. And now it's done quite a major rethink. So in a way, what's going to happen perhaps is CMA and things like it are actually going to, in a sense, shift the direction of discussion within the IMF. So the IMF, in a sense, will accommodate the initiatives like that, and therefore may maybe there will be a kind of emerging analytical predisposition. I think it's a very important point that we should mention. On the BRICS, I haven't followed it closely though, Murray. Actually, apakah Indonesia mahu berengkau ke BRICS? Laju pertumbuhan ekonomi Indonesia jauh lebih tinggi daripada laju pertumbuhan India, Brazil, South Africa, Russia. It's only China which is a bit faster, not much faster. So I'm not sure whether BRICS are going to be that important, are they? And whether they can be cohesive. It's not clear to me that they really will be. I could be wrong. On the G20, I haven't followed. I'm not aware of discussions in the G20 which are going to focus on reserve building, but maybe there are. I guess it's going to go through the IMF again, and maybe that's part of another process because the G20 is much more inclusive than the old G7. That will be another factor which will push the IMF a bit towards becoming a bit more acceptable politically, as well as a bit less doctrinaire economically.
Yeah, but please. Last question. And yeah,
my name is Budy. I was instrumental in the banking payment arrangement concept initiative in 1998. We initiated this between Indonesia and Korea. Between the commercial banks making a payment arrangement, but supported or facilitated by the agreement between the central banks. This is similar to bilateral swap arrangement, which now you put only a second preference. I think recently Korea, Japan, and China. I think however, I don't follow quite the details of that agreement, but that trilateral swap arrangement is basically based on making use of the local currency. While I see all the arrangement you presented still based on the foreign currency or US dollars, while the bilateral banking and payment arrangement which we initiated is making use of the US dollar only as the denomination and making use of that only the difference between after a certain period clearing, so however, so it is local currency based arrangement. How do you see this concept be introduced, in particular after China, Korea, and Japan recently agreed to use this banking payment arrangement as a new safety net concept? Thank you.
Terima kasih Pak. I'd like to hear more from you about this negotiation, karena memang ada yang bicara yang tidak tahu dan ada yang tidak bicara tapi tahu. I think I'm in the first group and you're in the second group. You've got much more closely. I think what I should have emphasized a little bit is memang ada macam-macam krismon and macam-macam krisis. That is, sometimes it's a balance of payments crisis, sometimes it's a fiscal crisis, and sometimes it's a financial crisis. And in principle, you need different kind of instruments for different kinds of crises. So my impression is that bilateral swap agreements are probably going to be the most attractive way forward if it's clear that the CMA is not going to work. And therefore the question is, just like with bilateral trade arrangements, as Mary said, can you actually multilateralise a series of bilateral swap agreements, that is, bilateral between countries, the same way that can you multilateralise a series of bilateral trade agreements between two countries? My impression is that it's quite difficult. Mary knows that much more about the trade side, but I've seen very few cases outside of ASEAN itself where bilateral trade agreements can actually be multilateralised. That was, of course, one thing Hadi was talking about a lot, how to make a broader East Asian trade area on the basis of these series of bilateral spaghetti bowl kind of arrangement. It's not clear to me that the bilateral swap agreements could also be multilateralised, because I think each one would have specific requirements and details which other countries wouldn't agree to. I think also one of the challenges in thinking about particularly the Japan, China, Korea triangle seems to me, as one who's outside the region and observing it very closely, one of the problems in the region, and of course I remember Hadi very clearly talking about this, was the absence of regional leadership, that is, with the two dominant countries in the region both vying for regional leadership and neither really willing to accede to the other's proper place in the region. So my sense is that just like trade agreements can't be sort of folded into a plurilateral agreement, my guess is that bilateral swaps probably can't either. But in principle, there's nothing wrong with bilateral swaps, but there are some drawbacks, as I mentioned. But I'd be interested to hear more about your negotiations by some time.
I think you mentioned about bilateral trade. Yes. Yeah, this banking and payment arrangement, it doesn't work alone. It must be work together with the counter trade. However, it may look like limiting the trade from globalization or from more open into bilateral or trilateral, but somehow it could be a safety net, as we did in 1998, when all the LCs were not accepted. So counter trade is raised between Indonesia and Korea, followed by banking and payment arrangement between at the time BNI and Korean Exim Bank, and Bank of Indonesia and Korean Central Banks facilitated that arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question? Yes. Identify yourself. Terima kasih Pak Rizal. Thank you. My name is Sandra from Indonesia. Thank you for CSIS inviting us. This is really an honor. I'm working for international department which the CMIM and International Financial Safety Net is under our purview. So thank you that we have been invited, and this is really not even inside us, but also actually we couldn't agree more on what Professor Hamid has presented in this presentation. Thank you. Yes, lots of the CMIM itself is now doubling size to 240 instead of 120. And yes, this is the challenge remains, where this is probably not quick disbursing facility of financial safety net. But it is too early for us to be skeptical on CMI itself, because it has not yet been tested. What we have here is large creditors such as Japan, China, and Korea has something like maybe so its commitment by opening local currency account at the central bank of counterparts, including account Indonesia. Secondly, on Yes, I think it is really complement to what we have on the IMF facility. But then, since it is not a quick dispersing facility, probably I need to have a view from Professor Arndt on how to cope this challenge by probably making not the procedures but asking a lot more commitment from the landscape. Secondly, third on Amro itself. Yes, 100% we agree that Amro is still in infancy. This is not really comparable to the credibility of ADB and IMF. What we have here that we have to express some explanation that Amro is really being dominated by +3 instead of ASEAN, and that's why probably lots of economists in Amro is not really the man behind the gun. So probably since they test on the some of the economists are well placed as they also qualified. On the Amro, probably we need to have also oversight on how to make the Amro enhance its credibility as a tool. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Pak. Ini sangat menarik ya, karena Anda jelas tahu banyak tentang the inside story. Saya hanya tahu sedikit tentang the outside story. So terima kasih banyak. I think you've hit the key point, that is the +3, to Japan, China, Korea are really dominating the story. That's because, of course, we're putting most of the money. And therefore, the danger is that just like the IMF is seen as external to the region, without really sort of deeply understanding the region, the danger, I guess, is that the +3 will in a sense dominate the operation of AMRO, and therefore it won't become fully engaged with the ASEAN countries. So I think it's still a problem with AMRO, and it would be in the same way that I guess the IMF would be more credible if it preaches transparency and good governance, that the managing director is always a European, and the World Bank preaches good governance and transparency, but the president is always a US citizen. Clearly, AMRO will be more effective if it's entirely a merit-based selection process and not a country-based selection process with the +3 government. Thanks for your comment. Yeah, on the quick dispersing facility, I think it's only going to work if the funds are directly within the institution which makes the decision on conditionality and therefore releases the funds. As I understand it, and you would know more about this than me, but as I understand it, because the reserves are still held within each country, and each country has to sign off on the release of those funds, almost certainly if you hit a really bad crisis which requires resolution very quickly, you can't do it quickly. And in fact, as my co-author Menon once said, he was interviewed in the press, and he said, so who do you call at 3 o'clock in the morning when the crisis hits? Well, there's nobody to call, actually. So I think there needs to be ongoing reform of both the structure of AMRO, the way it's set up, how the people are appointed, but also the way it runs the system.
Pertanyaan terakhir, ya silakan.
Terima kasih Pak Rizal. Good morning. I'm Hamid from Bank Indonesia, a colleague of Pak. I also agree with your point of view that there are many weaknesses in the chairman as a regional financial organization. But I'm less pessimistic than you about the future of this mechanism. First, for simple reason that many parties in the region, even the IMF, have a lot of stake in the strengthened CSIS in the future. They have a lot of stake in the growing stable ASEAN. And why I see this regional cooperation is, for instance, more powerful than bilateral swap arrangement. Because in this bilateral swap arrangement, we, especially as individual ASEAN countries, are in weaker position than our plus three countries, Japan, China, and Korea. It is the objective of the ASEAN countries to move toward this regionalism, to the regional cooperation in the form of CSIS. Actually, also to strengthen the position toward the ASEAN Pacific. If before we talk about that ASEAN Pacific is still dominant in the CSIS, I agree with that. But I think in the future, the dominance will be lessened, will be reduced, in the sense that it's not only from the point of view of the Japanese side, but also from the point of view of the interest of the Japan, China, and Korea in the group, in the economy of ASEAN. They invest a lot of more and more in ASEAN. Their intertrade also between the ASEAN Pacific countries is also growing. Also, the supply chain network in ASEAN. So, they have a lot of interest and stake in the stable ASEAN. And they understand that to create a stable ASEAN, regional financial cooperation is a key. And why? Because not only from the mechanism itself, CMIM also learned many countries in the region how to pursue sound and prudent macroeconomic policy. We know that before countries able to tap the facility from CMIM, they need to show that they have implemented a sound macroeconomic policy. So like small country like Brunei, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, nowadays they improve a lot in terms of macroeconomic policy. And I'm confident that in this region, it's a small chance that we have a case like the Greek, in the sense that there's one country that deviates from the common international standard of monetary policy. That's from the point of view of the ASEAN countries. From the point of view of the ASEAN International Monetary Fund, I believe first that they need to combat the stigma problem in the region by offer more cooperation to the region. Recently, there are discussion about the cooperation in the surveillance mechanism between the UMRO and the IMF. We understand that the surveillance capacity of the UMRO is still limited, and there is an area of cooperation between the IMF and the UMRO instead of the strengthening of the surveillance capacity of the UMRO. Second is that from the Eurozone crisis, I think the region and the IMF also learned that they cannot work alone by themselves to solve the problem. First, because of the size of the crisis, need a substantial size of the financial facility. Second, IMF also need the regional know-how of the country in the region to solve the crisis if it happened in Asia, in the region. And also from the point of view of the country in the region, that increasingly realizing that they cannot work alone and not cooperate with the IMF. I think this belief is shared by many countries in the region. The only challenge is that how to find a modality of the cooperation between the regional financial arrangement like CMIM and the IMF. That is my point of view. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak Pak. Banyak hal yang menarik ya. Let me just respond to a few points ya. Memang saya setuju dengan Anda on a lot of it. And obviously it's too early to judge AMRO. Itu masih bayi, umurnya hanya 2 tahun saja, and it takes time to establish institutional credibility. So I agree. We have to give AMRO time to see whether it can really make a difference. Maybe we've got to think Jakarta panjang mungkin sampai 10 tahun saja, 2 tahun jelas tidak cukup. Yeah, so I agree entirely. We have to think about it, and I think as Ibu Mari mentioned earlier, the IMF is also changing. Yes, so both bodies are kind of reaching an accommodation. I think that's a very important point. And saya setuju sekali dengan Anda about the good macroeconomic management in the region. I guess that's one of the lessons learned from the PRISMA, the Asian financial crisis. In fact, I think there are a couple of people in this room who've been unfortunate enough to have inflicted upon them my Southeast Asian Economies course. And one of the references I use in that course is a wonderful piece by Professor Max Corden called Pragmatic Orthodoxy, trying to explain the evolution of East Asian macroeconomic management. I'm just trying to update the paper at the moment, and one of the clear lessons from updating the story, which the paper was written in the mid-1990s, is how countries have responded very effectively to the Asian financial crisis. A good example, of course, is Indonesia with your fiscal law and your independent central bank, and the macro record's been remarkably good. The way public debt's fallen so quickly, inflation's been kept under control. So I agree 100% with you. Maybe where the question is about ASEAN itself as an institution doing the hard analytical thinking that's needed. I'm a great admirer of ASEAN. ASEAN is a fantastic achievement. It's the most durable, most effective regional association. I think it's fantastic. I would apply for membership. It's fantastic. But looking from outside, you have to ask the question, has ASEAN invested enough in the analytical capacity to be able to address some of these really big questions? And maaf sekali ya, kalau ada anggota dari ASEAN Secretariat di sini, I think maybe mungkin belum ya. Memang saya mengerti bahwa ASEAN tidak mahu banyak, Eurocrat, like a Brussels in Jakarta. I understand, but it seems to me that it has to have enough investment in this, analytical capacity to be able to lead the debate. If it doesn't have that investment, and of course the investment's happening at the country level. Like for example, Bank of Indonesia has this very large research office, very clear at the country level. At the regional level, my impression is it isn't still very strong. And again, that's another point that Hadi would always make, that ASEAN to be an effective player, including at the seat at the table of the G20, has to have the analytical capacity to influence the debate. Otherwise, the debate's going to happen outside the region, and ASEAN has a passive sort of role.
Terima kasih Pak Hamid. Saya kira cukup menarik ya. Lecture pertama, the first Hadi Soesastro lecture given by Pak Hamid, and I think that's it's really the beginning of a series of lectures that will come again in the future. Sebelum break, saya ingin mengingatkan bahwa jam 11.15 ada sessions tentang political developments dan juga economic developments. Dan ini menjadi tradisi dari launching buku Indonesia Update. We try to invite those who actually speak at the update in the year before the book is launched. And here today we have Ibu Sandra Hamid. She's going to give the update of the Indonesia's political update. So what happened, from September last year, up to today. That means that she must include the result of the CSIS survey. That was update of the update. And also Jose Rizal, the head of the economic departments of CSIS, will also give us the update of the recent economic developments. Thank you. So the graphic is outside. Thank you very much.